Will, does profit matter in an early stage startup? People want to know. Founders want to know.
Yeah, it's funny. It depends who you ask, right? If you ask the investor, they'll say sort of. Now that's the part I think founders are thinking, oh, well, every investor wants to see a profitable startup from day one. But Ed, you've looked at tons of deals. You've been a GP, you've been on that side of the table. How did you feel about it on the early stage stuff?
In the early stage stuff, it doesn't necessarily matter, but when it matters, oh my gosh, does it ever matter? So what I'm saying is, if a startup came to me and said, all right, here, we're at an early stage and we've already got profit, like we have a member we're advising and they're profitable in month 3 bootstrapped, then it really mattered. Like that made a huge difference. And they're getting a phone call every week from VCs, right?
Right. Well, look, if you can get profitable, sure, it always helps. The question I think here is how important is it? If I'm in early stage, and let's define early stage. Let's say early stage is from the moment you had the idea till the moment you raise, like let's say up to $1 million. And not that it couldn't go further, but that's kind of where we're really talking about it. Like in those formative years, pre-seed in most cases. I don't see a lot of pre-seed startups with a nickel of revenue, much less profit.
That's right. I think that we can look at it from the evolution of startup funding. So way back in the day, it didn't matter at all. Can you even build it? Is it even an idea? Can you build it? That mattered.
Right.
But then later on, people started building these startups where profit never mattered. It was like the Amazon and the Ubers. And investors, they kind of soured a bit on that a little bit, because how long is this going to take? Is my money going to be locked up for the next 10 years before you even turn any profit? Then I think these days people are looking at path to profitability. There are comments like back a few years ago, it was get to ramen profitability. That's going to help you. But now I'm starting to see revenue start to matter and path to profitability. Like investors are starting to have that conversation now. And so I think there's been a shift in the funding environment if that's what you're going for funding.
Yeah. And I think my first thought is let's get to some version of profitability, regardless of investors, because in my mind, and let's say you and I build a $10,000 a month ARR or MRR business, right? And $10,000 a month, maybe not all the money in the world, depending on what our costs and lifestyles are, but it's enough to kind of keep the lights on.
Oh yeah.
And I think the difference between a business that can throw off that kind, and we're saying profit, in this case, we're saying revenue, but I think the difference in a business that can throw off that kind of revenue, right, and keep our lights on gives us so much of an advantage in fundraising, in operations, because the best way to fundraise is to not need money. Now, that's kind of unrealistic for most people, but having some income offsets that a ton. You know what I mean?
Okay, but let's talk about it from this perspective, Will. What should matter? So we're saying revenue, like let's stack rank what should matter, the priorities when you're at an early stage to eventually get to profitability. Profitability is not at the top. What is going to go close to the top?
I think close to the top is what is the minimum we need in order to just keep the lights on. Right. That is threshold number one. And by the way, that's not necessarily a big number. So, for example, going back to you and I starting a startup together, right, Ed? I would look at it and say, hey, man, what do we need to pay our server bill, to pay our miscellaneous SaaS costs, and just keep, say, marketing going? And you might say, hey, well, that's $5,000 a month. So my first threshold is let's just get there, which usually we don't even need to raise money for, right? That's just operating it all.
But that will implies that someone is actually going to pay for the startup.
Yeah, right.
So you're saying, let's think about how we get someone to pay, even if it's not profitable, to get some revenue. And if we can just break even on servers and things like that, then we're good.
Right. And so really we're talking about not just profit, but revenue in this case. And there's a lot of ways to get there. I think a lot of people think about, oh, well, the whole product isn't built yet. The whole company doesn't exist yet. So how could I possibly have revenue? Dude, there's so many ways to make revenue, right? You guys can do consulting, right? We can do a consulting version of our business until we get the product going. Tons of companies do that just to get revenue in the door. I hate to say this, but if I'm being honest, we could get other jobs. We could be bartenders. We'd be the oldest bartenders ever, but we could be bartenders, right? To offset what it takes, right? We just need something to keep things going.
And in my experience, well, I don't know if you've seen this, but I actually had an investor impressed because we decided to consult first. It was a product and we said, we're just going to make money. And I said, to fund this whole thing, I'm going to make money and consult in the vertical, in the industry, in the space, solving maybe an adjacent problem. The investors actually like that more than we're waiting to generate revenue. What's been your experience that way?
100%. I mean, the famous story that's on Startups.com when we interviewed Brian Chesky of Airbnb, his big thing of how he kept the lights on was during Obama administration, when he was running, he went out and ran to the Democratic rallies and created a cereal called Obama O's.
Yes.
Right.
And McCain Flakes. I remember that.
Yeah. Captain McCain's. right?
Yeah.
That's what he was doing to fund the operations, which is mainly him, of Airbnb while he was trying to get it going. And dude, that's Airbnb. So if you're like, hey, I'm too good to do whatever, what the hell, man? That guy was willing to, and I remember he said he didn't sell a lot of Captain McCain, so that's what he ate for like the next year, right? So
I
I'm
didn't
just
know
saying,
that.
like, that's Airbnb, and you're telling me you can't get a bartending gig? I'm half kidding about the bartending gig, but I just want to point out revenue is all that matters. And we're using revenue and profit a little bit differently here, but that early cash is all that matters, however you have to make it.
And this is a message to the founders I'd like to share, sitting on the side of the table of investors and making those decisions. If a founder is willing to go out there and do that, like Brian Chesky, like their team went and sourced the cereal bulk,
Yep.
got the box printed, glued the boxes by hand, like they were it was a sticky mess. I believe that the founder has what it takes to get the startup to profitability when it's time.
Absolutely. Show that you'll do whatever it takes to move the startup forward, and that will attract investment. But I think Ed and you and I would both agree, you don't need to make moves specifically to attract investors. You need to make moves to build your business, which should then attract investors. Investors should be a second order of magnitude.
Validate your business so that
Yep.
customers will pay for it, and then things will come into place. You can optimize. But here's the last question on this topic, Will. When does profitability matter? When should founders start thinking about it? What's in it in the future?
It matters so much later for most startups. Now, again, this isn't for every business, but for most in the startup world, what we have to prove first is that our business, the business model actually works. So we can sell stuff for less than we paid for more than we paid for it, right? And once we figure that out, you mentioned Uber, right? Once Uber figures out the model, the business model, that they can put people in a car and have it make a profit, then they can worry about profit. But most startups don't get to the point where they've proven the model for years and years and years. So it's unrealistic to think they'd be profitable early.